Hello and welcome to the Project Good podcast. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Hilton. Project Good is a social impact podcast interviewing experts and advocates about the pressing problems that we face globally and hearing how we can move forward in the future. The Project Good podcast is brought to you by Project Good Work. The goal of this podcast is to inspire people and organizations to develop a mindset that can move others to positive action regarding the complex social issues facing people and the planet. For September, we're focusing on juvenile justice. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Jennifer Peck, an associate professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Peck's research interests focus on racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system, treatment of disadvantaged groups throughout the juvenile court processing, and special populations in courts and corrections. Dr. Peck's work focuses on a long-standing problem of social and racial inequity in the justice system and bringing them to the light for change. Let's get into the interview. First, let me introduce our guest, Dr. Jennifer Peck, who is an associate professor at the University of Central Florida in the Criminal Justice Department. Her recent publications appear in Justice Quarterly, Law and Human Behavior, Crime and Delinquency, and Race and Justice, an international journal. Dr. Peck is passionate about advocating for youth in the justice system by regularly revealing how young people are treated like adults instead of children going through the challenges of adolescence. Welcome, Dr. Peck.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So before we jump into the questions, I always like to know what drove people to do what they do. So what drove you to study and focus about juvenile justice?
Sure. So this was kind of beginning when I was a master's student at the University of South Florida, earning my master's and later doctoral degree. And I took a graduate course on race and crime. And I had grown up in upstate New York in a very kind of homogeneous, middle-class population, and really was just introduced to this concept of race and crime in my graduate course. And at first, I was just amazed, but then also feeling pretty horrible about what was going on in our juvenile and criminal justice systems, because I had no idea about this while growing up. And so during my master's and doctoral studies, I had the opportunity to work with some wonderful mentors in the Department of Criminology at USF, whose research was focusing on racial, ethnic disparities in our juvenile justice system. And so from there, I was starting to learn about different types of community disadvantage, social inequalities, economic inequalities that all started to transfer into why we were seeing more racial and ethnic minority youth going through our juvenile justice system. So really, it kind of turned into this turning point for me instead of just graduating with my master's and going to work for the CIA or the FBI or, a letter organization like that, that really I wanted to enact change by conducting research on these topics, but then also being able to teach college students about some of these topics that I was never aware of until I was in graduate school. So it was an opportunity to become a professor by being able to have that wonderful combination of teaching as well as conducting research and working with community partners to enact hopefully some change and help decrease the presence of these disparities in our justice system.
I guess just to get at the core, because as I was preparing for this interview and, I started to notice there's like different levels of where the justice system gets involved and also I guess how people view juvenile justice issues. And the three levels that I was finding, and you can, of course, correct me if I'm wrong, this is just me doing some quick research being not an expert in this topic, is that I saw that there were what I would call and I've just categorized these issues and made them my own names, of kind of the boundary testers, which is kind of what adolescence I always think is about. And those were the people who were, maybe they skipped class or, continue to be disruptive in class. And then there were the people who were influenced by their environment. So I would say they were called the environmentally influenced folks. And what I mean by that, maybe they grew up in a rough neighborhood where it just was normal to have violence or see crime or drug dealing or even in some cases, maybe they experienced child abuse or something of that sort. And then the third level that I seem to come to, and I just made this kind of a larger category, are I would say the ones that would be, I guess, mental health issues, because sometimes there are youth that are on a different level or scale that doesn't have anything to do with the environment or testing boundaries, just like adults as well. Just you may have a mental health issue. And so those were the three main parts that I was finding. And I would say, I guess, one of the things that started to concern me as I was looking and researching as well is that, I guess, the harshness that was put on youth. And so would you say that just to start off with, because I was, as I was looking at this, that the U.S. is like really hard on young people, or do you think that's not necessarily so?
So in terms of, the U.S. being tougher on youth compared to other countries, I would agree with this. And now there is some issues here due to a lack of record keeping, right? Because unfortunately, not every country throughout the world is able to provide accurate statistics about the number of youth that are incarcerated in our United States. But so worldwide, it's not presently known, but certain agencies have actually estimated that more than 1 million children are incarcerated throughout our world. But other agencies have found that the U.S. leads our industrial world in the number and percentage of children who are in detention and in residential facilities. And so this was from a 2019 United Nations report. So I would say that even though throughout the last 10 years or so, we have been incarcerating youth at fewer numbers and percentages than previous years, we are still far more doing this than other countries are. And that's just one thing in terms of incarceration. One example I think to think about is that typically in our United States, our juvenile court jurisdiction over youth. So basically, depending on what age a youth is, will they be handled in the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system? There's a great amount of variation across the country. So for some instances, some states do not have a lower limit. And what I mean by that is a youth of any age could be arrested and referred to our juvenile justice system. Or if a youth is 16 years old, maybe compared to 18, they can automatically be waived to our adult criminal justice system. So even though they are biologically at 16 still considered a youth, legally, they could be considered an adult. And that doesn't necessarily happen in other countries. Now, there has been this successful push to raise the age in our juvenile court jurisdiction. I'm sure you've heard that in yes. some of your research. And they've been recently trying to implement some of this legislation. But what I think would be interesting is to follow some examples of other countries to actually include emerging adults. So individuals who are 18, 19, and 20 years old, to keep them under juvenile court jurisdiction as well. So I know, for example, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, they've either raised the age to 20 or looking to do so. And this is what's been going on in some other European countries. Germany, the Netherlands, they apply juvenile sanctions, They put individuals in facilities, in courts, who are still 18 to 21 years old. So they're still understanding that there might be some adolescent behaviors that are going on, even when they are between the ages of 18 and 20. So I think that that's an example of, what the U.S. is trying to do with trying to raise the age to 18, but other countries are noticing differences in children and adolescents compared to adults, even up to the age of 21. And so I think that's another way to show that, if we're keeping youth who are 18 and younger incarcerated, well, then of course we're going to have higher numbers than some of these other countries, depending on what we legally consider who's a juvenile.
Yes. I guess the line that I was trying to, aside from, of course, people that are doing really horrendous things, but that's something else that I'll probably bring up a little bit later, is I guess what are considered, this is what I was finding in research, is that where the line is of what are considered normal parts of adolescent development, for, independence, that adolescents at the time are trying to fight for independence against their parents and authorities and things like that. Like, where's the line should be before it becomes like criminalization? Like, where do we say that, okay, they're just being a kid, or is it really a crime?
And so that's the difficulty there, right? So, research shows that most youth will outgrow their misbehavior without extensive treatment, right? So interventions technically should be, short term, keeping kids in their community, minimally disruptive, to not have them start to go through the pipeline of the juvenile justice system. But, in regards to your question, there's this interconnection between politics, the economy, the social structure, and our justice system. So if we look back historically, many of the laws and statutes made by our juvenile justice system, were made by local and state and national government, but based on perceptions of what should be done for youth who misbehave. So it's one of the ways of thinking the government wanting to control youth versus rehabilitate them and treat them. So in other words, the way that the criminal justice system controls adults was starting to trickle down to youth who are engaging in what they were saying are illegal behaviors, even though we know that children are different from adults in numerous ways. So, that's where I think we talk about different statutes, like what is a status offense versus what is a delinquent offense. And I'm not sure if that's kind of something we want to talk about differentiating it, because I think that might get to what you were talking about in terms of what constitutes an offense.
Yes, that's actually one of the questions that I wanted to ask. I guess, can you explain, I guess, the difference between those two types of offenses, between a status offense and a delinquent offense?
Sure. And again, this gets back to your question as well. It's like, what do we determine is something that needs to have corrective action by our juvenile justice system? So status offenses in our system, they are basically behaviors that youth have engaged in. It's when adults, though, if they engaged in that behavior, would not be arrested. So in other words, the behavior is only illegal because the person is a juvenile. So some examples could be drinking alcohol, running away from home, violating curfew, truancy from school, and then incorrigibility at home. So depending on the state, now kind of backtrack a little bit, our juvenile justice system is not a federal system. Every single state has its own separate system with different statutes and laws and procedures. So depending on what state you're in, you may be referred to juvenile court for a status offense, but in another state, you may be handled more within a child welfare or other different type of system. So some status offenses are handled in the juvenile court, or they're considered children in need of services or families in need of services. And so some of these status offenses in the states don't even go into the juvenile court because they're not wanting to have youth become in contact with that system. But it all depends on where youth live. So some argue that youth who commit status offenses are pretty much engaging in typical youth and young adult behaviors, kind of like you were just saying when you were asking your question, right? Like many juveniles may, experiment with drinking alcohol, run away from home, violating curfew, so on and so forth. But other behaviors, maybe such as chronically running away or missing school consistently, that could demonstrate that these youth may have underlying needs that could be addressed by our juvenile justice system through some type of community-based services. So there's that fine line if, is one individual skipping school once a month? Do they need to be coming in contact with our juvenile court? Or are we seeing, for example, a girl who is consistently running away? Is there some underlying problem that, yes, that technically is a status offense, but it may be that this youth has specific risks and needs that we could try to address with intervention in our system. So there's definitely differences in terms of the severity and the culmination of status offenses compared to our more delinquent or standard offenses that we would see in our criminal justice system.
Yes, and like one of the things, especially for status offenses, and I may be considered, I guess, maybe old-fashioned if I say this, is like, where are the parents?
Yes. Yeah.
But and so because I know these days it's well, I guess I shouldn't maybe laugh at it, but people have a different mindset these days. But I think that parents do play a big part with their children and their behavior. Like I said, I guess I'm maybe old-fashioned in how I think, but I guess where are the lines? Like, for instance, I'm just going to make up a scenario, but in the instance of the girl continuously running away, I guess where in the system should they, have a talk with the parents? Perhaps the parents are abusive, or maybe they're not abusive, they're just the neglectful, and they're just like do whatever you want to do, which there are parents like that. So I guess is it really? I'm not saying that blame shouldn't, the person actually doing the thing should, experience some of the blame. But in the case of juveniles, I guess, are the parents just not to blame at all? Or where does that fall? Where does that fall in the midst of all of this?
Yeah. And I'm going to sound like a broken record throughout our whole chatting session, because I'm going to keep saying it varies from state to state, because it depends on how each local juvenile justice system operates and how involved they want the parents to be. So in terms of going back to your example, if we have this girl who's consistently running away, and maybe she's brought into a juvenile assessment center by law enforcement, there are things called risk and needs assessments that an intake officer or probation officer will administer. And what it was, it's a long questionnaire and interview about school-related factors, family situations, history of mental health, substance use, living accommodations. And they will try to contact the parent as well to kind of get a bit more information about what's going on in the family situation. Unfortunately, sometimes there are situations where a parent may say, I can't control my child. If they come home, they're just going to run away again. And, they'll try to do an individualized plan for that youth. Or they may have the parent who is more involved and says, look, we are having some issues. Maybe it's a type of just learning how to communicate more, some family type of therapy. And because the juvenile justice system was founded on the best interests of the child and more individualized rehabilitation, the system therefore can try to help form a plan of how to meet the needs and address the risks for that family as well. So that's kind of, one example based on your scenario. But I think, in terms of what role parents play, sometimes I think we need to look at the larger picture. And so, for example, children are honestly, I believe, innocent bystanders sometimes. and even kind of victims for some of their parents' circumstances. Whether it's the individual behavior of the parents or larger societal issues. So for what I mean here is, for families who live in poverty, unemployment, residential instability, children can't, escape from these natural criminogenic environments. Their childhoods are very different compared to their affluent peers. And we know that justice-involved youth they share very similar characteristics. And some of those you already identified, right? Impoverished childhoods, abuse or neglect, trauma, family instability, limited employment opportunities. And so what happens is that many of these children are born into this situation that they can't actually control. Children of the poor, those with less educated parents, they don't have the resources necessarily to overcome their obstacles sometimes. And so it's difficult in terms of we want to look at the individual behavior of the youth and of the parents themselves, or taking a step back and looking at larger and historical, structural, and economic inequalities that have turned into kind of this path of families that have been for generations in that type of system. So, parents, I don't think, can automatically be blamed for the behavior of their children, but sometimes I think there needs to be a lesser focus on what the youth did and the individual decisions of the families, and then kind of put a larger focus on our larger structural inequalities that have really kind of just translated to these long-stemming problems for impoverished families. So it's almost like thinking about the larger picture versus those individual decisions, if that makes sense. Because for one example, it could be, there may be single parents who work multiple jobs and are unable to supervise youth during the day. And so if a youth is getting in trouble during that day, it's not necessarily that the parent doesn't want to supervise them, but they're pulled in multiple directions because they still have to work and provide for the family. So if a youth is brought into our juvenile justice system, those risk assessment instruments, those types of interviews that they have with court actors can get more of the larger picture of what's really going on in the family and trying to help address some of those issues.
I guess when they start to see, hopefully, I know it doesn't happen in all cases, but if they start to see the larger picture with the example, let's say for the girl that she has, maybe an abusive father and the mother works all the time, so she doesn't really see the abuse, or she doesn't have a close enough relationship with her mom to tell her what's going on. Let's see, I guess in those cases then, because she has already been doing these status offenses, I guess, are the status offenses usually overlooked, or does she still then become part of the system? Is that, I haven't found which, I see that sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't.
Yes. And that again goes back to just the individualized nature of our system. They don't necessarily want to pigeonhole youth into, well, you have this factor going on in your life and you have this situation going on, so we're automatically going to remove you from the home and place you in a facility. There's a growing reform efforts about wanting to keep youth in a community. They want to keep them in positive environments. And if that environment isn't necessarily so positive, they will try to go ahead and figure out, are there more maybe stable family members, potentially, grandparents, aunts, uncles that a youth could spend some time with. Maybe there is a foster care or group type of home that a youth could be placed in for a certain amount of time while the parents are trying to, hopefully, if they're, wanting to be invested in this, work on their situations as well. Because ideally, they don't want to separate families, but sometimes, depending on the situation, removing a youth from their home may be a more positive outcome and, transition for a child than keeping them in that home environment. And so it's difficult, in researching and talking with youth, because sometimes you don't want to say, oh, well, you were placed into a residential facility. Well, at the same time, that facility might have more stability and structure and opportunities than a youth who is currently in their own home right now.
So I guess you would say that the biggest thing that puts youth at risk for getting into like a juvenile detention center would be the continuous instability of like home, and then the continuous happening of offenses, or are there other things that put them at offense for ending up in like juvenile detention centers?
Yeah, so you nailed it on the head in a couple of the instances, and I can kind of provide a few more examples. I think I'm just going to backtrack real quick to kind of, when we talk about juvenile detention centers, is people think that there's many different ways that youth can end up in a detention center. There's multiple options. So detention is really this broad term that is used whenever housing a youth in a facility when they're under custody of our juvenile justice system. So when a youth is first referred to the juvenile court, they can be placed in detention when they're initially arrested and they're awaiting their initial appearance. So basically the court's deciding, we need to ensure you're going to come to your first hearing. You need to stay in detention. All right. So that's what we talk about in terms of pre-trial or pre-adjudication detention. And then youth can also be held in detention after this initial hearing throughout the whole court process before, their final case outcome or disposition is determined. And so that way they're ensuring they're still going to continue to be coming to all their hearings and meetings. But then also, youth can be held in detention when they're awaiting to be placed in a long-term residential facility, because detention is supposed to be short-term care only, while, for example, they're waiting their hearings or they're waiting to be placed in a longer-term residential facility. So we can use the terms, juvenile detention or residential facilities interchangeably, but those facilities are technically longer-term placements. So kind of in terms of what you were asking is like, what puts the youth at risk for ending up in a detention center? Concerning that pre-trial or pre-adjudication detention, so when youth are initially arrested and brought in, if they can be detained if they allegedly committed a specific offense that is serious enough by the juvenile justice system that they believe they should not go home prior to that initial hearing. We're talking about offenses where a youth allegedly had a firearm, a violent offense, certain situations like that where they may be at risk to hurt other people or hurt themselves or not come to their next court date. And so there might be some statutes in place where, well, if you're being charged with aggravated assault, you're going to be detained moving forward because you, in terms of public safety issues, we should keep you there. Another situation, unfortunately, that happens, and this goes back to our parenting conversation, a youth can end up in detention if there's not a parent or guardian who can come and pick them up. And so this is an example of an unintended consequence of our detention process, because let's say a child is arrested, brought to an assessment center. They're considered a low risk to recidivate. Maybe it was a trespassing situation where, they technically don't need to be held in detention because they believe that they'll come back, for their hearings. They believe that they're not at risk at all. But then what if the parent doesn't have a working cell phone or a house phone, or they're working at a job where they're unable to pick up their child? As a result, that kid has to stay in detention overnight.
Yeah, so I didn't even think about those, they're just just a regular kid, but their parents, can't do it or something.
Right. And then getting back to, what you were saying about what puts them at risk, that risk assessment instrument, they go ahead and give that to youth, basically for the purpose of detention. So again, like I mentioned, if there's an alleged offense, violence, maybe a situation of domestic violence, using a firearm, if they have multiple past referrals to the juvenile justice system, they're not brand new to the system itself. If they have a history of escaping, into many prior facilities, or if they haven't attended previous court dates. Let's see, if they are currently on probation, or if they have a history or indicators of any abuse in the family. These are some of the indicators that are going to say, all right, we're not going to have you go home for your court proceedings. We want to keep you in detention for those various reasons.
Now, one of the things I was also reading, and I don't know if it was just an off-tangent kind of thing that only some people are concerned about, I guess, are the juvenile detention centers themselves. Once children or adolescents are in these centers, a lot of people have concerns about the centers themselves, that sometimes, there's, I guess, multiple angles. There's, of course, the thing that happens just because they are adolescents influenced by other adolescents, and maybe, they get worse ideas. Or so there's that. But then there's also the thing that people are concerned about, the treatment of these adolescents once they are in centers, that they're already being thought of as criminals, or sometimes subjected to additional abuses. I don't know if that is like a high concern, or if it's just something that is a concern for just some, I guess.
Yeah, it is a concern. I wouldn't necessarily say it's countrywide a concern, but a youth can be affected by detention even in a short term. And so, for example, placing a youth in detention naturally means that they're being removed from their home and their family environment. So, they're missing days in school. They're not able to attend work if they have a job, any sports activities, or other responsibilities. So while school, counseling, treatment, and rehabilitation, those are available to youth who are in the longer-term residential facilities. But as I said before, detention centers are meant to be short-term housing. And so now specifically, I'm more familiar with our juvenile justice system here in Florida. Those youth in detention do receive education, mental health, substance use, and healthcare while in detention. But at the same time, once you're removing youth from their home, they're going to be missing out on their natural, and daily routine. And, many justice-involved youth, they have a history of trauma, as we talked about briefly before. So that actually, being held in detention, exacerbates the feelings of being abandoned if they're placed into a facility that's not in their typical home environment. And so those are some of just like in terms of the routines, but in terms of the conditions of our detention centers, you're kind of spot on about what unfortunately negative situation should happen, which is why I think, detention centers should be held for youth in certain circumstances. So, in talking historically about in the 1990s, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, it's OJJDP, that's kind of our main, funding source and national information about juvenile justice. They reported that there were substantial issues with juvenile detention centers. I mean, we're talking about inadequate health care, lack of treatment services, an excessive use of solitary confinement, and even the use of physical restraints. But throughout the last 2 decades, there have been major reform efforts around trying to reduce these instances. And for one thing, besides, going ahead and improving these conditions, we're seeing a lot of these facilities actually closing in the last 10 years, which naturally would go ahead and reduce the instances of negative situations happening in detention, because we're finding that we're able to keep youth in their communities without seeing this increase in crime. So it's almost like a two-tailed effort where for those detention centers that are still opening, there has been a large focus on reforming the conditions of detention, decreasing the length of stay for kids who are in there, and then not even placing youth in detention unless they're considered a flight risk or, a an issue with public safety. Some states have even said, unless, if there's a minor offense or a nonviolent offense, you will be staying home for your disposition. We will not be, placing you in any facility.
Yes. And so, I'm glad to hear that now that there's a greater focus on mental health and redirecting in youth. One of the things, and just kind of transitioning to a different angle of this topic, as you know, and everybody saw in 2020, that race became another hot and heated topic that continues to be one of the things that America deals with on a daily basis. And so, of course, one of the big things that's always brought up is, and we saw obviously with the George Floyd, I know obviously he wasn't a juvenile, but just as a lot of African Americans and minorities in general are looked at as sometimes criminals in society. How does race, I guess, play for juveniles? We've seen obviously all these killings, so it's I have lost count, and just to be honest, I've become I unfortunately, I guess it's part of this is sad to say, but I guess it's part of being an American. You become desensitized to all of these killings. I don't even know anymore about each of the scenarios, because I've gotten to a point that I'm just like, oh, okay, everybody's upset for a week, and then we move on, and then another one happens, and I almost don't feel like there's an end to it. So I guess why would you? I guess historically we know the background of race in America, but why is it hitting our youth so hard? Because that's a lot of the people who have gotten shot and all of this other stuff.
And it's something like you just said. The issue of race has been an inception since America began, and it's the same thing with the juvenile justice system. Unfortunately, the presence of racial disparities has been evident in the system since its inception. In fact, racial disparities are one of the first things that stands out in what the juvenile justice system looks like. And for example, it's the Sentencing Project is a foundation and organization that focuses a lot on disparities in our juvenile court. And are finding just recently, Black youth are 4 times more likely than their white peers to be held in these juvenile facilities. And even though we're starting to see fewer youth being held in facilities, this race gap is starting to get a bit smaller, but it's still larger. It's still evidently pretty large. So, our juvenile court statistics are a little delayed compared to some others because, again, since it is a state-run system, it takes a while to have all of that data accumulated and put into national statistics. But we're seeing, the white placement rate, so white youth who are placed in these facilities are about 114, per 100,000. And that's 114 for whites, but we're seeing 315. The youth placement rate was 114. There we go. The Black placement rate was 315 per 100,000. And then whites were 72 per 100, right?
Oh my
Exactly.
Wow.
Wow. Right. And it's one of those, I want to answer your question. I want to talk about that definitely. But sometimes I just was sometimes we need just some statistics in the beginning to show okay, this is actually happening now. And even though we are seeing some decrease in disparities, those are some still pretty, large differences right there.
Yes. I didn't even realize, I knew it was large. I didn't realize it was like that. It's almost, there's, you'd have to, if you were just you'd have to say, okay, there's either a certain race is so bad, right, or something, or there has to be something not right, because that's an extreme. I could see if it was like 100 to maybe 300. It's still a lot, but we didn't even get into the same triple digits.
Right, exactly. 315 to compare to 72 or 72, right. And it's honestly, this is something new also with COVID happening. We're starting to see that white kids are being released from detention centers at a higher rate than their Black peers. And kids of color have already been detained for longer periods of time prior to the COVID pandemic. And so this gets back to your question about like, what is going on? Like, what are some explanations? Why are we seeing this? And it goes back to, I think it's difficult. This is such a complex question, and it's one of those where, I've been researching for now 11 years about these disparities, and people ask me and they want that like one sentence answer, right? Like, why do we have these racial and ethnic differences? And it's so complex and so multifaceted. But to kind of help a little bit, there's these two broad explanations that people talk about why we see these disparities and how they're, pretty increasing or decreasing, throughout the years. But one of them is what we call our differential offending explanation. And what that really means is that the argument that minority youth engage in more serious and more frequent offending more so than whites. All right, so they're engaging in more serious crimes and they're engaging in that more often than whites. So because of that, more serious crimes, a higher number of prior referrals, well, then that's why you're going to see more minorities compared to whites in our system. So, that's one viewpoint. The second viewpoint is what has we've been seeing more in the last few years, especially getting back to your comment, is this differential selection or selection bias argument. And this gets at the explanation that juvenile court actors, so police officers, judges, probation officers, they have these implicit biases, perceptions, and beliefs about Black and Hispanic youth compared to whites. And because of these negative stereotypes and biases and attributions for why they may be engaging in crime compared to whites, that's why we're seeing more Black youth being arrested, being formally charged, being adjudicated. We don't say guilty in our juvenile justice system, to decrease stigmatization and labeling. We say adjudicated. And then instead of a sentence, they receive a disposition. So the other argument says that, well, based on these selective biases, this is why we're seeing these racial and ethnic disparities. But even I would say that even at before both of those, I think also it gets back to, and I talked about it briefly, problems with poverty, unemployment, lack of opportunities, which occur across all races, but tend to be more detrimental for minorities compared to whites. So if minority youth are coming from communities that have fewer alternatives to institutionalization, like they don't have the resources in their communities, they may have them be placed in institutions because they don't have the social services, the educational resources, mentorship in those communities. So it's almost like, well, we're not going to put them back in their communities because they don't have the services there. They need to be in institutions. A lack of funding, like mental health treatment, extracurricular activities, those are less, judges in the juvenile justice system are less likely to release youth who have committed such offenses but don't have access to those resources. And what are we seeing? We're seeing that more youth are coming from these communities of being a racial and ethnic minority. So it's very convoluted because let's think about this. I started with the whole, differential offending explanation. If they're engaging in more serious offenses, is that because they live in impoverished communities with a lack of opportunity. They see their friends in gangs. They have the increased presence of firearms. It's easier to, engage in illicit activity in those communities. And is that why they're engaging in more frequent offending? Let's look at the selection bias example. If there's the perceptions that, we have certain hotspots where crime is more likely to occur, and these hotspots tend to be more in inner city and minority communities, well, then the police may be going into those communities to then have more over surveillance in that.
Yes, so, actually, that was something I was going to ask. So, yes, I was wondering if they go into those communities a little bit more, because I've heard people talk about that as well, as that because they know, like, I have obviously never been a police officer or anything, but I know obviously that, you're supposed to be, as a police officer, taking, guarding the public, taking care of things. And so you go to the places where that there would be problems, but even and then you are on the lookout for problems. So that's a factor, I guess, that is always brought up by a lot of people, is that it's because people are out there looking for a problem. So if you look for a problem, you'll find one.
Well, it could be that, and also let's think about the fact that maybe certain offenses are able to be, done in closed doors. So, there is drug use that occurs throughout lower, middle, and upper classes. Drug use occurs throughout all socioeconomic status. But certain drugs potentially could be exchanged behind closed doors, which people are not, it's a more private type of situation. I'm just giving one example. Versus there be other situations with drugs that are more in the public eye. So naturally, if certain offenses are occurring more often in the general public, it's easier for law enforcement naturally, whether they're looking for or not, to see certain things happening in certain areas compared to others. That's one of the difficulties in there. And so, we have those two main explanations for why we see minority overrepresentation. But at the same time, I do think it's a larger societal issue that both of those explanations stem from issues of poverty and lack of opportunity and, difficulties with school and education, mental health services, and so on and so forth that have been going on for generations. Even one more example, if we think about the pandemic, like I mentioned, fewer youth are being detained during the pandemic, but when they are, it is a greater proportion are being detained for serious offenses, which should be happening. We're talking about, especially with a weapon, violence, and then what they are seeing is that there is a higher number of minority teenagers who are more likely to be detained and are being detained for those offenses. So it's unfortunate. I wish I would have that one sentence answer, and I'm sitting here talking your ear off for 5 minutes on the one question, because it's so multifaceted.
No, I know it's a huge problem. One of the things too, the thing is when you mentioned that they would send over non-minority youth or white youth because they have the resources within their community, and then for minorities not having those resources in the community, it puts them in, I guess, a continuous cycle. And so somebody that stole the candy bar, now because they've stayed into the system is now into murders or something like that. Because, of the continuous exposure and, what it does to you mentally. I guess, is there, I want to say, is there any hope almost, but is there hope that, I guess, that this can actually be corrected?
So I do think that there's hope. I think one of the things we need to think about is, again, it's multifaceted, but in a way to talk about this is in a larger larger ways of thinking about it. I think we need more support from the general public, and I can talk about this with different aspects. But the first one is support for the general public about specific policy reforms. And what I mean by this is just like what you were saying with the kid in the candy bar example. Reinvest in communities so youth can be kept in their homes and that they're not placed outside and into confinement because of their behavior. I think it's something about, the general public, I think, could be more educated about the characteristics of kids who come into contact with the system. There's a history of abuse and neglect or family situations or mental health problems. And recognizing that they're not these super predators. They're not these rational decision makers who choose to engage in these behaviors, but a lot of them have just risks and needs that can be addressed with treatment and services. And even better, if those services can be done in the community. I honestly believe that we need a society that's committed to child welfare, enacting laws to kind of alleviate these root causes of inequality and poverty, and make people realize that we do really need to invest in youth. And, not to sound cliche, but they're necessary for the future of survival. And so, we have decades of economic inequality, concentrated poverty, racial isolation, lack of opportunity. And unless we can see some changes and have the public realize that this is what's going on, and want to invest in it, that's what I think is you're going to start to see the trickle down effect of fewer youth in our system. But also, we're actually at our lowest juvenile crime rate in the last 40 years across a nation. But the media and the general public, they see these situations on the news and on social media about juveniles engaging in these heinous behaviors. That's a very small proportion of all of the juvenile offending. And I think it's almost where we need to focus on the positives and the success stories of youth who became involved in our juvenile justice system versus some of those small, not small in terms of impact, because there are some heinous offenses, but the small number of youth who are making the news. It's almost like they're focusing more on the negative and then the positive. I think if the media and people were to see some of the positives of our juvenile justice system in terms of rehabilitation and focusing on the risks and needs of youth and realizing the majority of offending will decrease as youth get older, we can get more kind of support from the public and from legislators that change can be made. But it's going to be, many people say that's not possible.
I think it is possible. I think it's possible only because of, the media obviously has an extremely strong influence, as we have seen in this country, as now the country itself is, on almost every issue, people are taking sides. So, and that's really because of the things that they have seen either on television, through social media. I think right now media has the most influence that I have almost ever seen, because people live and die by their media almost these days. Yeah. And so, yes, I actually did read the statistic that you were talking about that, actually rates have gone down, because I was I was double checking, because I was like, is that right? Because the way that the media has you thinking, I was thinking that, youths are out of control. We got to maybe start tasering them.
Exactly. It's trying to find more that's what we see in the media. And don't get me wrong, especially in this last year, we have been seeing specific cities that have had some increase in violence and in homicide, including with juveniles. But the general national rates over the last 40 years have been steadily decreasing. But just like you said, I have debates with my family about this, and I don't ever like to pull, hey, I have a degree in criminology. I teach statistics to my undergraduates. I don't like to pull that card, but I'm like, this is what the data show, not what you're necessarily seeing, on the nightly news.
Yeah, no, because the nightly news would have you believing that we are, spiraling out of control, and maybe we have to rethink. Because I have a daughter, and I was like, I was thinking that I got to have some serious talks. We can't do this, this,
Right.
Yeah, that's what they have you believing. I guess now one of the things, because things have been decreasing because of the pandemic, I guess I'll say we are still in the pandemic as we have the Delta virus. Rising.
Yeah.
And so young people were being released because, of course, we don't want to continue spreading the virus.
Yep.
But do you believe also because of from the mental health aspect that this being locked up and not being able to socialize as they usually do as kids, do you think that in the future that because of this pandemic it will lead to problems among our youth?
But I think this is a two-pronged question here, because research has shown that any time spent in detention, in terms of being away from your family and your friends and your routine, can be negatively impact youth, especially with COVID, when youth have been still being detained. In-person visits were completely halted. There was video conferencing only. And so the release of youth into the community is positive with this pandemic, because they were still together, with their family. But I think if we look about this in terms of the pandemic and mental health and potential increased problems for youth, I think it's possible, but I think it's also something that all of us, regardless of age, are having to deal with right now. I think many of us need structure, routine, stability in our life, and the pandemic turned that upside down for all of us, right? And so even though there was that decrease in referrals to the juvenile justice system, and this could also attribute because youth were not going to school. They had the closing of recreational areas, social distancing mandates. But just like you said, we're starting to see that increase in mental health needs, increases in family conflict, decreases in educational attainment in this past year. So these can have short and long-term effects for not only youth, but all of us. And so while I believe it's a positive note in the direction that we were able to detain less youth and not see this increase in juvenile crime, I think it's a way to look at the larger picture that all of us have been kind of going through some things throughout this past year. And so we need to all be cognizant of our own mental health needs, and then definitely for children as well, because sometimes they may not be realizing what they're feeling unless you start to notice some things of acting out. So I think it's a time for all of us to be more aware about how we're feeling, and therefore how our children and our family is feeling. Because again, the positive note is we're having less youth detained, we're having fewer youth referred to the juvenile justice system, but this pandemic has impacted all of us. So I think we definitely may see some short and long-term effects. And me and some colleagues right now are beginning to take a look at some of those impacts within, Florida's juvenile justice system, where we're working on a proposal right now to try to look at the different risks and needs that youth are having, not only pre and post COVID, even though, like you just said, we are still in our COVID world, but then also how this changes over time with having more school resource officers in schools. So we're looking at kind of these natural experiments of when certain things have happened to youth throughout these last 5 years, what are the characteristics of them? Like, what are we starting to see changes in with them?
I guess to kind of conclude a little bit with all of this, because there's so many different I guess, layers to the juvenile justice system, and especially with what you specialize in with looking at racial disparity, which is a major social issue that I think will take definitely time to get through. How can, I guess, for the everyday person, I guess, how can they help either change the system or change their mind, or how can they make a difference in this area?
So I think, it's such a great question. And some of the parts, I highlighted real briefly about, just learning more about youth in general and, supporting, specific policy reforms, and really just educating ourselves a little bit. So, for example, I think we need to show the general public that there needs to be a smaller emphasis on the youth's individual behavior and cultural factors, and then focus more on structural inequality to explain, differences in people's lifestyles and circumstances. I think that, the general public and people can help. I think education is the first step. Just learning more about the fact that children are not necessarily capable of making sound-minded and rational decisions. Children are different than adults. Their decisions are often due to the environment that they live in. And, what we talked about earlier about, potentially they only know based on what environment they're in and what they see in terms of what their family situation is. Adolescence is a time with the inability to assess consequences. Emotions influence youth's judgment so much more than adults. They're emotionally charged, which, compromises their decision-making ability. They're more heavily influenced by those reward centers in their brain. And so I think it's time for the entire country to understand these differences. And so whether it's just understanding children are different, the use of, if there's potential, volunteering or mentoring services, specifically in underserved communities. There are numerous different types of community-based programs that would love volunteers in terms of checking out your local areas. Even just, small Google searches about the juvenile justice system and contacting probation officers or court actors there about, are there opportunities to, do after school activities with youth, or if there's youth in detention centers. So here in Hillsborough County, a few years ago, we had yoga instructors going into the detention centers to just have, youth take yoga classes, because it's just a way to help build connections and mentorships and realize, again, that these kids are kids and they have risks and they have needs, and they're not necessarily this separate label of juvenile offenders. Like, we don't like that label. They're youth who are involved in our juvenile justice system. And they look very similar to other children who are not involved. And so I think what people can do is help learn and educate themselves to decrease that stigma. And like you mentioned, be critical with the media. Just don't take a story for what it is at face value, but do your research and realize that, our juvenile justice system is making reform efforts. They're focusing on rehabilitation. They don't want to see youth coming in through the door over and over again. So, but they need the resources to do that. And so I think that's more at the local and state government level to invest in our children here.
Yes, I agree. I 110% agree in mentorship. I think it makes a big difference in a child's life. Just having somebody to pay attention. I forget, I was reading some statistic about that of like, how much a child needs attention. And, you think about it more of when they are in the, of course, the baby stage, because, you feel that you have to do, obviously feed them and stuff. But they also say, I was reading in the statistic that actually when they get to those teen years, those years are actually the more critical years to be kind of like that on your toes with them, because those are the years that they are, coming into who they are going to be or start to be as adults. And from our perspective as a society and things like that, especially American society, those are the years that we're trying to push them away from us.
Right. But exactly. Yes. They're the ones where, that's when they're starting to form their identity, and they need to be able to be transparent and communicate with parents and adults and all of that. But like you said, you want them to like fly the nest and learn on their own. But sometimes we still need that communication and that cohesiveness with them. You're right, 100%.
Yeah. So, so definitely as they enter the teen years, parents, pull your kids closer.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you, Dr. Peck, for your time and insight. This has definitely enlightened me and taught me some new things about juvenile justice that I did not see before. One of the things, I wasn't even thinking about just, the parents that are just out there busy working and, their kids end up in this situation, not because they've done anything wrong, just because, they're busy parents. Yep. For everyone, it affects us in so many different ways. Even if your child doesn't end up in this situation, they may have a friend that ends up in a situation like this. This is extremely important that we all really look at it. So thank you again. And so if you have a passion for an unserved community, a social justice problem, or simply want to change minds, contact Project Good Work at projectgood.work to start your project of change today. Thank you to our listeners, and thanks for tuning in to Project Good, where we're focused on what matters.